At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's GeneralG. Let's begin. The incident that revealed that humans were immune to the deadliest poison in the galaxy occurred on the very planet where the toxin had first been discovered. The farmers of planet Zoar captured a human trespassing on their land, and during the interrogation, a local landlord became the first galactic citizen to learn the shocking truth. Humans were not only immune to the spores, they actually found them so delicious that they were willing to risk their lives just to obtain a bit of what they called golden spice. Loeli sat alone in the living room of her farmhouse, a place she rarely visited anymore. The main estate in the city was far more comfortable, with its climate-controlled rooms and proximity to civilization. But here she was, summoned by employees who claimed they'd caught something that required her immediate attention: a human trespassing on her land. The couch beneath her was worn but sturdy, much like everything else in this old house. Loeli shifted her weight, feeling the impatience radiate from her very core like heat from a star. Her silver skin, so reflective it caught and threw back the amber light from the overhead fixtures, rippled with the tension in her muscles. Every few seconds, her expressive face betrayed her growing irritation, a tightening around her eyes, a slight downturn of her lips, the way her high cheekbones seemed to sharpen with each passing moment. Her purple eyes, deep as twilight on a moonless night, constantly surveyed the entrance. She hadn't blinked in nearly a minute, her gaze fixed on that door with an intensity that would have unnerved anyone who might have been watching. Her mind wandered through the sparse information she knew about humans. They were one of the newer species to join the Galactic Federation, bipedal like her own kind, and, interestingly, one of the few species whose faces could convey emotions in a way similar to her people. Their expressions could be read, their intentions sometimes glimpsed in the movements of their features. This made them less alien than most, though no less mysterious. What was a human doing on Zohar? This planet was remote, agricultural, far from the trade routes and diplomatic centers where humans usually congregated. And more importantly, what was one doing on her land? The main door suddenly burst open, pushed with such force that it slammed against the interior wall. Loeli's eyes snapped to the entrance as three of her strongest male workers appeared, their broad shoulders filling the doorframe. They wore the typical attire of farm laborers: sturdy pants stained with soil, loose shirts that had seen better days, and wide-brimmed hats to protect against Zohar's orange sun. Their silver skin glistened with the day's exertion, and their purple eyes were dark, conveying something between anger and uncertainty. Between them, they dragged a figure, the human. Two of the males had him by the arms, and they weren't gentle about it. They shoved him forward with enough force that the human stumbled, his feet scrambling for purchase on the smooth floor. The third worker gave him a final push from behind, and the human went down, landing hard on his hands and knees before Loeli. "Mistress Loeli," the first male said, his voice respectful despite the violence of his actions. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, and he gave a slight bow. "This is the human we caught stealing from the western orchards." The second worker stepped forward, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "We found his spacecraft hidden in a clearing among the trees, mistress. Small vessel, one-person capacity. We still have no idea how the military base in the city didn't detect the invasion. The defense grid should have caught any unauthorized entry." A third male, younger than the others, added with obvious confusion, "It's like he just appeared out of nowhere, mistress. No alerts, no warnings, just there, among the golden mushrooms." Loeli remained seated, her posture perfect, her silver hands folded delicately in her lap. She let the silence stretch, watching the human on the floor, noting the way his chest heaved with each breath, how his fingers pressed against her floor as if testing its solidity. Finally, her voice cut through the quiet, calm and cold. "What is your name, human?" The man's head tilted. She watched as his eyes, a startling brown, warm and deep, moved between the males flanking him and then settled on her. There was intelligence in that gaze, a quick assessment of the situation. He seemed to realize in that moment that she was the authority here, the one whose judgment would determine his fate. He shifted on the ground, and despite his position, he tried to maintain some fragment of dignity. His voice, when it came, was steady. "My name is Ethan." Loeli simply stared. Her hands moved slowly, gracefully, to brush a few strands of her lavender-colored hair from her face. The hair was long, falling past her shoulders, and it reflected the light as it moved. Time stretched. She counted her own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let him feel the weight of her scrutiny. Let him understand that his life hung in a very precarious balance. When she finally spoke again, her tone was polite, almost gentle. "Ethan, what were you doing on my land?" She paused, letting her purple eyes bore into him. "I should warn you that my species is not known to be very understanding with criminals. We have our own ways of handling those who steal from us." Something shifted in the human's expression. His jaw set, and before any of the males could react, he pushed himself up from the floor. He stood, brushing dirt and dust from his clothes. Loeli felt a flicker of surprise. The males tensed, their bodies coiling like springs ready to release. She could see it in their stance. One word from her, one gesture, and they would show this human exactly where he belonged. And yet the human seemed entirely unconcerned by them, his attention focused solely on her. "I wasn't here to steal anything your species considers valuable," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I haven't touched any of the fruits you grow, not a single one, and I certainly didn't go near those six-legged beasts you raise as cattle. I'm not an idiot." He was lying. In her mind, Loeli knew it with the certainty of someone who had spent years managing workers, negotiating with merchants, and occasionally dealing with those who thought they could take advantage of a female landowner. She leaned back, her mind drifting to a memory she rarely visited. Her father, she could see him as he'd been decades ago, standing in this very room. She'd been young then, barely old enough to understand the full scope of the farm's operations. Pirates had come to Zohar, thinking a remote agricultural world would be easy prey. They'd landed on her father's property, demanding tribute, threatening violence. She remembered the coldness in her father's eyes, the way he'd dismissed her and her siblings to their rooms. She'd pressed her ear to the door, hearing raised voices, then silence. The next morning, the pirates were gone. Their ship was gone. Her father never spoke of it, and no authorities were ever involved. Not the local police, not the Galactic Federation peacekeepers, nothing. If she had to guess, those pirates were buried somewhere on this very farm, their bones enriching the soil alongside the fertilizer and compost. The thought should have disturbed her, but it didn't. It was simply how things worked on Zohar. Remote worlds had their own justice. "You're lying," Zoe said, her voice cutting through her memories. She leaned forward, her silver skin bright. "If you weren't here to steal our produce or livestock, then why did you come? Ships don't just accidentally land on private property. You evaded our planetary defense grid. That alone is a serious crime. You trespassed on my land, another crime. And my workers found evidence that you've been here before, multiple times, based on the tracks near your ship." She stood now, her full height impressive even by her species standards. She took a step toward him, then another. The males shifted to flank her, but she waved them back slightly with one hand. "I want the truth, Ethan, because if I find out you're lying, if I discover even one of my cattle missing, even one crate of fruit unaccounted for—" She let the sentence hang, her purple eyes never leaving his face. "Well, let's just say that this farm is very large, with many places where things, or humans, can disappear. Many people have managed our lands for generations without outside interference. We prefer to keep it that way." The threat hung in the air between them, unsubtle and very real. Ethan took a step toward her, then another. The males tensed visibly, their bodies coiling, ready to surge forward at any sign of aggression. Loeli felt her own pulse quicken, though she kept her expression neutral. He came close enough that she could see the details of his face, the lines around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the way his pupils dilated slightly in the dimmer light of the room. Close enough that if he wanted to harm her, he could try. Close enough that her workers would tear him apart before he managed it. "You're right," he said, and his voice carried a note of earnestness that caught her off guard. "I was wrong to be here without permission. I admit that completely. I should have sought authorization, should have gone through proper channels, should have tried to negotiate with your species despite your reputation of being hostile. But," he held up a hand as if to forestall her response, "but I never stole anything that you or your people have a use for. That's the absolute truth." His expression shifted, excitement creeping into his features. His eyes lit up, and he actually smiled. "What I've been collecting from your farm is the golden spores, from those glowing mushrooms that grow everywhere on this planet. You know the ones, spherical caps, bioluminescent. They cluster around the base of your fruit trees in the irrigation ditches. They're all over the place here." Loeli blinked. She turned her head to exchange a look with her workers. The males stared back at her with identical expressions of confusion and disbelief. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, unbidden, laughter bubbled up from Loeli's chest. It started as a chuckle, then grew into full, genuine laughter that made her shoulders shake. "The golden spores?" she managed between laughs. "You want me to believe—" She had to pause to catch her breath, wiping at her eyes. "You want me to believe that you came here, risked criminal charges, evaded planetary security, all to collect the galaxy's deadliest poison?" She stepped even closer to him, her amusement fading into something more analytical. She studied his face carefully, noting the firm set of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the way his muscles moved beneath his clothing. He was fit, strong, built like someone who could handle himself in a fight. "I could perhaps believe you if you told me you were an assassin," she said slowly, circling him slightly. "Or a mercenary seeking to acquire the poison for some shady business venture. The golden spores sell a fortune on the black market, I'm told. 1 gram can kill hundreds depending on the species." She stopped in front of him, her arms crossed. "But if that's your game, you're not leaving this planet alive. I don't approve of anyone stealing from my land to cause harm to others across the galaxy. I'll bury you myself if that's what this is about." "No!" Ethan's response was immediate and emphatic. He held up both hands, his expression shifting to something between frustration and desperation. "That's not it at all. I'm not an assassin. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up slightly. "My friends and I, we like the golden spores, as seasoning, as spice. They add this incredible heat and flavor to food that you can't get from anything else. It's amazing." He started pacing, his movements agitated. "My buddies back on the trading station, they're willing to pay me a lot for this stuff, not to kill anyone, to put on their meals. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get this real quality spice out on the rim? Everything's synthetic or stale or costs a fortune, but these golden spores? They're perfect, except they only grow here, on Zohar, and your people won't export them because you think they're just a nuisance." He turned to face her directly, his voice rising. "That's how I ended up on your planet in the first place. I heard about these mushrooms, how they grew wild on Zohar, and I thought, why not? So I came, I collected some, and nobody got hurt. And you know what? Those golden spores are basically a weed for your people. I've been doing you a favor. I'm removing a pest from your crops. You should be thanking me for cleaning your fruit trees instead of treating me like a criminal." Silence fell over the room. Loeli stood perfectly still, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Her workers looked equally stunned, their mouths hanging slightly open. This human actually claimed, that he and his friends ate golden spores. For pleasure. The same golden spores that were classified as a Class A biological hazard by the Galactic Federation. The same spores that required specialized containment and disposal protocols. The same spores that had killed 12 researchers during the initial survey of Zohar 50 years ago, their respiratory systems shutting down within minutes of exposure. It had to be a lie, some kind of elaborate scheme. But what could he possibly gain from such an absurd story? If he wanted to steal the spores for weapons or assassination, he'd have been better off claiming ignorance or making up a more plausible cover story. This was so ridiculous that it almost had to be true. Various scenarios played through Lowell's mind. Maybe he was insane. Maybe human psychology was so different from hers that his reasoning made sense to him but appeared as madness to her. Maybe this was some kind of bizarre cultural ritual, a taste of courage where humans dared each other to consume poisons. Maybe he was telling the truth, and humans actually were immune to golden spores, and the Galactic Federation simply hadn't discovered this yet because who in their right mind would test poison on themselves? She gave up trying to logic through it. There was one way to find out the truth, one way to call his bluff if this was indeed a bluff. "I have a proposal," Lowell said, her voice calm and cold. She folded her hands in front of her, the picture of reasonable authority. "If you really claim that you and your friends enjoy eating golden spores, then I will have my workers bring some here, fresh ones, picked directly from the mushrooms. You will eat them in front of me. If you survive, I'll believe your story and let you go. If you die," she shrugged, the gesture elegant and final, "well, then my employees will bury you somewhere on the property and dispose of your ship. That's how things work on this planet. We handle our own problems our own way. Do you understand?" She expected fear. She expected him to break, to admit the lie, to beg for mercy or attempt to negotiate. Instead, Ethan laughed. He actually laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "A dinner," he said, grinning at her. "If we're going to do this, I want a proper dinner. My friends and I don't just eat golden spores straight. We're not savages. We use it as a spice, as seasoning. It goes on food." He stepped closer, meeting her purple eyes with his brown ones, and Lowell felt a strange flutter somewhere in her chest. The sheer audacity of this human, standing in her home, caught stealing from her land, facing possible death, and making demands. "Share a dinner with me," Ethan said, and his voice had dropped to something softer, almost intimate. "If I die, well, you can call it my last meal. But when I survive, and I will survive, at least I'll have the memory of sharing a meal with the beautiful silver alien lady who caught me stealing the weeds from her farm." Lowell felt her face do something she couldn't quite control, a slight widening of her eyes, a faint shift in her expression that might have been shock or might have been something else entirely. Beautiful? Had he just called her beautiful? The shamelessness of it, the absolute gall. She should have been offended. She should have had her workers drag him out immediately. Instead, she found herself fascinated. Annoyed, yes. Frustrated by his attitude, certainly, but also curious. How could a being like this exist? A human who, even facing death, had the confidence or stupidity to flirt with his captor? Who could look at a life-threatening situation and decide to make amends, to push boundaries, to smile and joke as if this was all some grand adventure rather than a potential execution? "Fine," she heard herself say, the word leaving her mouth before she'd fully decided to speak it. "We'll have dinner. You'll eat the golden spores, and I'll see what happens." She turned to her workers, who were staring at her with expressions of absolute bewilderment. "Prepare a meal. Include some golden spores. Fresh ones, harvested today. Bring them to the dining room in 1 hour." All the males filed out, shooting uncertain glances back at the human. Lowell found herself alone with Ethan once more. She wasn't sure if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or stumbling into something interesting. Either way, she was committed now. Might as well see it through. 1 hour, she told him. "Don't make me regret this." His smile widened. "I promise you won't." That night would become a turning point in Lowell's life, though she wouldn't fully understand it for years to come. Over dinner, as she watched Ethan sprinkle golden spores over his food with the behavior of someone adding salt, she learned truths that would reshape her understanding of the galaxy. She learned that humans were indeed immune to the poison that her people feared and respected. She watched him take his first bite, her body tense and ready to call for medical assistance. But he simply chewed, swallowed, and smiled with genuine pleasure. "Perfect," he said. "Maybe a bit mild, actually. Do you have any that are more mature?" She learned that there was a market, an actual thriving market, for the spherical mushrooms that grew so prolifically on Zohar. The golden spores that her people spent resources removing, that they burned in specialized incinerators, that they treated as dangerous waste, were valuable. Not as weapons, but as a commodity, as food. She learned about human taste preferences, about their evolutionary history with capsaicin and other irritants that they'd somehow learned to interpret as pleasure rather than pain. She learned that across human space, there were people who actively sought out ever more intense experiences, who prided themselves on their tolerance for what they called heat. And she learned that Ethan himself, despite his criminal trespassing and his audacious attitude, was entertaining. He told stories of his travels, of the trading stations where he worked, of his friends who pooled their money to send him on this expedition. He asked about her farm, about Zohar, about her people's history with genuine interest. He made her laugh more than once, his humor dry and self-deprecating. By the end of the meal, as he demonstrated his complete immunity to the golden spores by consuming an amount that should have killed him 10 times over, Lowell found herself thinking about possibilities, about supply chains and export licenses, about how those troublesome mushrooms might transform from a nuisance into a resource, about how this human who'd broken into her property and stolen from her land might actually be the key to something larger. It was the beginning of a partnership that neither of them could have predicted. In the years that would follow, as they navigated Galactic Federation regulations and local laws, as they built infrastructure and established distribution networks, as they weathered the shock and controversy that would inevitably arise when other species learned that humans not only tolerated but craved the deadliest poison in the galaxy, they would look back on this night as the moment everything changed. The rise of the first galactic spice business had begun in a farmhouse on Zohar, born from an unlikely meeting between a silver-skinned landowner and a human who had been desperate enough for flavor to risk his life. 5 years had passed since that fateful dinner, and Galactic Inspector Livix found himself descending through the atmosphere of Zohar with a sense of profound unease. His small inspection vessel shuddered slightly as it broke through the cloud layer, and he gripped the armrests of his seat with all 6 of his appendages. Livix was a Carithian, a species whose green exoskeleton and multifaceted eyes gave them an appearance that humans apparently found insectoid, a term he'd learned and didn't particularly appreciate. His kind prided themselves on their attention to detail, their logical minds, their adherence to regulations and proper procedure, which was exactly why he'd been assigned to investigate the disturbing reports coming from this remote world. As his ship lowered toward the designated landing zone, Livix pressed his face closer to the viewport, and what he saw made his mandibles click together in distress. Fields. Enormous, carefully cultivated fields, stretching as far as his compound eyes could see. And they weren't growing fruit or vegetables or any of the traditional crops that Zohar had been known for. Nope, these fields were filled with spherical mushrooms, their golden caps glowing faintly even in the daylight, arranged in neat rows like soldiers on parade. They were farming poison, deliberately, extensively, on an industrial scale. "This cannot be legal," Livix muttered to himself. "This cannot possibly be within regulations." His ship touched down with a gentle bump, and Livix began the process of checking his environmental suit. The reports had assured him that the spores were only dangerous when inhaled directly or when they contacted mucous membranes, and that the outdoor air on Zohar's agricultural zones was safe. Still, he triple-checked his filters. He hadn't become a galactic inspector by taking unnecessary risks. When he finally emerged from his vessel, the sight was even more staggering from ground level. The mushroom fields extended in every direction, their golden glow creating an almost dreamlike landscape. Workers, Locals, with their characteristic silver skin and purple eyes, moved through the rows with harvesting equipment. They wore simple protective gear, nothing like the hazmat suits that should have been required for handling Class A biological hazards. A transport vehicle approached, kicking up a small cloud of dust. It stopped a few meters from his ship, and a figure stepped out. Livix recognized her immediately from the briefing materials. Lowely, owner of what was now being called the largest spice empire on Zohar. Her silver skin gleamed in the sunlight, and her lavender hair was pulled back in a practical style. She wore work clothes, nothing formal, and her expression as she approached was distinctly unwelcoming. "Inspector Livix," she said, her voice flat, "I received notice of your arrival." "Landowner Lowely," Livix replied, inclining his thorax in what he hoped was a respectful gesture. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I have questions about—" "Stop," she interrupted, holding up one silver hand. "Before you continue, let me make something clear. My dealings with humans and my business operations are my concern. The laws of Zohar give me the right to refuse to answer any questions from Galactic Federation officials about my private business practices, provided I'm not violating interplanetary trade regulations." Livix's mandibles clicked in frustration. He'd been warned about this. Zohar's planetary government was notoriously protective of local autonomy, and their laws did indeed give landowners broad rights to refuse cooperation with federal investigators. It was a legal loophole that had frustrated many of his colleagues over the years. "I understand your position," Livix said carefully, "but surely you can appreciate the Federation's concern. You're cultivating a substance that has been classified as one of the most dangerous toxins in known space. The golden spores have killed members of other species," Lowely finished for him. "Not humans. The deaths occurred before anyone knew humans were immune. There have been no human fatalities associated with golden spores. Not one." "Well, that's not the point." "Then what is the point, Inspector?" Her purple eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to take a step back. "Are you here to tell me how to run my farm? Are you here to dictate what I can and cannot grow on my own land?" Livix tried a different approach. "I'm here because there are concerns across the Federation about the implications of this trade. There are reports, unconfirmed but deeply troubling, that consumption of golden spores by humans has made them dangerous to other species, that their very blood has become toxic, that their saliva—" "Rumors," Lowely snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Panic and gossip without any basis in fact." "But if there's even a chance—" "There isn't." She stepped closer to him, and Livix found himself backing up despite himself. "Inspector, let me be very clear about something. Those rumors that golden spores make human saliva poisonous to other species, they're false. Completely, utterly false. I give you my word on that." There was something in the way she said it, a certainty that went beyond mere business knowledge. Livix's compound eyes studied her face, noting the slight color change in her silver skin. A faint darkening that his briefings had indicated was equivalent to a blush in her species. Livix thought for a moment and decided not to pursue that particular line of inquiry. Some things, he reflected, were perhaps better left unexamined. "Even if we accept that the saliva concern is unfounded," he tried again, "there are still questions about the broader implications. Humans are a relatively new member of the Galactic Federation. We don't fully understand their biochemistry. What if—" "What if, what if, what if?" Lowely mocked, her tone dripping with disdain. "Inspector, I'm not interested in hypotheticals. I'm interested in facts. The fact is that humans have been consuming golden spores for 5 years now without any negative effects on themselves or others. The fact is that my business is operating entirely within Zohar's legal framework. The fact is that I have all the proper export licenses and safety certifications." She gestured broadly at the fields around them. "These mushrooms were a nuisance, a weed that we struggled to eliminate. Now they're a valuable crop that employs hundreds of my people and generates significant revenue for Zohar. Should I have turned away this opportunity because it makes Federation bureaucrats uncomfortable?" It's not about bureaucratic comfort, Livix protested, his voice rising slightly. It's about responsible stewardship of potentially dangerous... My land, my choice, Lowell said firmly. That's the law here, Inspector. You may not like it, but that's how Zohar has operated for centuries, and the Federation accepted those terms when we joined. If you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, actual evidence, not speculation or fear, then present it. Otherwise, I'm not obliged to answer your questions, and I'm not going to waste any more of my time justifying my business decisions to you. She turned toward the vehicle, clearly done with the conversation. You're welcome to inspect the fields from a distance if you like, but you'll need a warrant if you want to enter my property beyond the public landing zones. And good luck getting one from our local magistrates. Wait, Livix called out, desperation creeping into his voice. At least tell me this. How did you convince humanity that this was safe? How did this entire trade even begin? Lowell paused, her hand on the vehicle's door. For a moment, Livix thought she might actually answer. Then she simply said, Humans are curious creatures, Inspector. They're willing to take risks for experiences that other species avoid. That's all you need to know. She climbed into the vehicle and drove away, leaving Livix standing alone beside his ship, surrounded by fields of glowing golden mushrooms that swayed gently in the breeze. He stood there for a long time, his compound eyes scanning the landscape, his mind churning through the implications. The Federation had sent him here hoping for answers, for leverage, for some way to regulate or control this trade that had so many officials nervous. Instead, he'd been stonewalled by local laws and a landowner who was clearly not intimidated by galactic authority. The locals of Zohar had always been notoriously difficult to deal with. It was part of why the planet had remained so remote, so untouched by the broader galactic culture. And now, that very insularity was protecting a trade that made every medical professional and safety officer in the Federation deeply uncomfortable. Livix climbed back into his ship, beginning the pre-flight sequence. He would file his report, of course. He would note the scale of the cultivation, the apparent disregard for conventional safety laws, the legal barriers to further investigation. But he knew, even before he'd finished writing it in his mind, that nothing would come of it. Zohar's laws protected Lowell, and if humans weren't being harmed, if no other species were being poisoned, if the trade was technically legal, the ship lifted off, rising through Zohar's atmosphere and breaking free into the black of space. As the planet shrank in his viewport, Livix found himself thinking about the humans he'd encountered in his travels. They were strange beings, often unpredictable, with their soft skin and their odd expression, with experiences that other species found unpleasant. They sought out loud noises, extreme temperatures, heights that induced vertigo, and apparently now, poisons that they'd somehow turned into a delicacy. What sort of beings were they, really? He set his course for the nearest Federation station, already dreading the debriefing where he'd have to admit failure. But as Zohar disappeared behind him, swallowed by the vastness of space, Livix couldn't shake one final thought. If humans could do this, could turn poison into profit, could trade with hostile beings like the people of Zohar, could create entire industries based on their unique biology and their apparently limitless appetite for risk, then what else might they be capable of? It was a question that both intrigued and terrified him, and one that he suspected the Galactic Federation would be grappling with for years to come.